Hi, welcome to MissionWary, a podcast from Mennonite Mission Network. On today's episode, Linda and I talk with guest Katerina Friesen about the Doctrine of Discovery. We'll explore what the Doctrine of Discovery means, both for the history of Christian mission and also the history of the places where we live. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Linda.
Hey, Travis.
Linda, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first time you heard about the Doctrine of Discovery?
Oh, wow. Like I said before in our first episode of MissionWary, I think some of those ideas were in my head, but the first time I really started understanding what Doctrine of Discovery was when I did the Trail of Death with Katerina Friesen, the person who we'll be interviewing today as our leader. And we had 2 days of orientation where we went step by step and talked about what it actually was. So I would say, with any understanding, the first time I heard it was about 2 years ago. What about you, Travis?
So I had the advantage of thinking about this question a little bit. Sorry, I guess. But the first time I actually heard the term would have been 2014, I believe, in orientation when I was going with Journey International to Indonesia for 10 months. And Journey International is a program of Mission Network that concluded a few years back, but when it was operational, they did a very good job of giving participants a bit of a quote-unquote crash course in anti-racism and anti-colonial thinking, or things to be aware of as participants were being sent into new cultures. And so I think that was the first time I actually heard of the Doctrine of Discovery. And I mean, honestly, it's a little embarrassing and frustrating that I went for so much of my life without knowing that, and indicative of the privilege as me as a white man, like not knowing about that, and in some sad way, like not needing to.
Yeah, well, and I just think if I had a more coherent understanding of what the Doctrine of Discovery was and like the roots of colonialism and how they were rooted in Christianity, what that would have done for the way I did mission in West Africa, you know?
Right. Like you said, we mentioned the Doctrine of Discovery a couple times in the first episode, but I'm really excited to dig deeper into what that means, and also how mission fits into this wider view of why knowing about the Doctrine of Discovery is important.
Yeah.
And going with that, I'm really excited to talk with our guest, Katerina Friesen, who, as you alluded to, you know already.
Yeah, she's one of my heroes, so I'm so glad I get to talk to her again today.
Let's just jump into it then.
Let's go.
Hey, this is Travis again. Before we jump into today's interview, we wanted to take just a second and let you know that this episode might bring up some strong emotions. As we work to unpack what the Doctrine of Discovery means, we recognize that all of us, those here on the podcast, and you, dear listener, come from various familial backgrounds, whether that's African ancestry, Asian, European, indigenous, or wherever you trace your family's history. We also recognize that as we discuss some of the topics in this episode, painful emotions might well up within us based on our backgrounds. Acknowledging how you feel, whether if it's anger, shame, sadness, or even just feeling overwhelmed, is important. And if you don't feel a strong emotion, that is just as valid. But we want you to know that just leaving you with those emotions isn't the end of the journey in this episode. Joe Lichty worked for peace in Northern Ireland for nearly 2 decades with a predecessor agency of Mennonite Mission Network. And he said, "The journey of repentance that Jesus calls us to take is hard, and many of us are skilled at skirting it. Down that road, however, lies the possibility of our personal redemption and reconciled relationships." Lichty also said that this is a joyous journey because it's full of grace. If you need to pause this episode after a particular section, we encourage you to do that. But we also encourage you come back to it, with the time and resources you need to continue on the road to becoming the people God called all of us to be. We've got links in the description of this episode if you'd like to know more. So, with all of that said, let's get to the interview.
My name is Katerina Friesen, and I am a pastor and educator working around healing from structural trauma, from structural violence. I also pastor a small church plant called Wild Church that meets outdoors, and I also am an educator, and I've been helping to co-lead, along with Rich Meyer, a Mennonite historian, and George Godfrey, a Potawatomi elder and teacher, to co-lead these pilgrimage groups every other year that follow the forced removal of the Potawatomi peoples from northern Indiana to Kansas. And so this is really a pilgrimage of lament and remembrance, and also bringing our questions as mostly Anabaptist groups around what does restoration, reparation, and healing mean today in light of the Doctrine of Discovery and the forced removals that resulted from that.
So this is our second episode, and in the first one, we discussed a little bit about the Doctrine of Discovery, but we didn't go into defining it too much, just because we didn't have the time. Would you be willing to give a little brief overview of what the term Doctrine of Discovery means?
Absolutely. It started with papal bulls, or religious document coming from the popes in the 1400s, 1500s, that gave European Christian rulers the right to invade, to seize, to conquer indigenous lands and peoples. And then these papal bulls really created the legal precedent, or international law, that gave settler governments and then settler peoples the rights to claim indigenous lands. So that's a lot there, and it can be really abstract. So one way that I come at this when I talk about it or write about it is really the image of the cross comes up. And some of us may have seen paintings or images of, Columbus planting the cross in the soil of a discovered lands, right? What later became like flag planting. So this cross planted in the lands, say, of the what are now the Americas, or Turtle Island, as some indigenous peoples call it. The cross of Christ was really distorted into the cross of conquest. And the Doctrine of Discovery is all about that transformation, or that distortion, where the cross came to represent Christian empire and dominion, claiming indigenous lands and bodies under European Christian rule. So under the Doctrine of Discovery, this cross has crucified so many times through forced conversions of indigenous peoples under the point of death, separated children from their families, through Indian residential schools or boarding schools. It's justified slavery and genocide and turned land into profit rather than land as something that's sacred. So I just want to emphasize that it's ongoing today. We see it through, for example, oil pipelines that go through indigenous lands. Other examples could be, missing and murdered indigenous women. That's a huge issue that's being raised, is why are indigenous women's lives being devalued and lost at such alarming rates. Some of the worst health disparities on reservations, the impacts of COVID now rampant on a lot of Native American reservations and indigenous lands. So those are just some of the ways that, this legal and philosophical, really theological framework continues to have ripple effects even today, since indigenous lives and bodies were seen as less than white European Christian bodies.
So for me, speaking as someone whose family came to the U.S. in the 1870s, there can be some temptation to hear about the Doctrine of Discovery and the dates you mentioned, the 1400s and the 1500s, and think, oh, well, the community that I come from, the Russian-German Mennonites, well, we missed all that. So what role have Mennonite communities played in the Doctrine of Discovery?
Yeah, I'm leaning on the work of, other scholars and practitioners who've done more work than I have around these stories. But from what I understand, and what's part of my own family's story of coming from a German-speaking Russian Mennonite background, was that Mennonites were often invited in by colonial governments, not only in the US, but also in Canada or places like Paraguay, to come and settle on what the government saw as open land, lands that didn't have agriculture as at least how they understood agriculture to look. And so Mennonites were known as to be good farmers, and they had established the reputation on the Ukrainian steppes, at least in the Russian Mennonite tradition, of converting before unproductive land into fertile farmland through their methods of crop rotation and through how they did agriculture and draining swamps and so on. And so I know that they came into the central states, Canada, were invited, given land by the railroads. And part of that was kind of creating a safety buffer, as I understand it, along the railroads to keep the indigenous groups who were fighting to reclaim their traditional territories from threatening westward expansion and profit for the railroads. We often talk about beating our swords into plowshares as peacemaking tools. And unfortunately, I think, as was so often the case, Mennonites' plowshares were beaten into swords. Who knows how aware or conscious we were in these processes, but white Mennonites at least have been part of these processes of colonization, and I think very much used by and cooperated with colonial governments to push indigenous peoples out. I should also say, I think Mennonites, Erica Littlewolf has pointed out that Mennonites are people of the land, and there are points of potential connection and solidarity between Mennonites and indigenous peoples as people who historically have, had a connection with the land. And I think displacement has really affected that and disrupted that connection with land. But there's some history to go back to of real love for God's earth. And, the early Anabaptists painted on caves where they worshiped, or they inscribed in caves, the earth is the Lord's, and everything therein from Psalm 24. So how is this concept of being driven out of their homes for the early Anabaptists who were persecuted, how could that create potential connections, points of connection with displaced indigenous peoples who have this sense of we don't own the land, the earth is as God's, as the Psalm says.
After the break, we'll talk with Katerina about why the word dismantle is used so often when talking about the Doctrine of Discovery. We'll look at some steps you can take in your community, and we'll also look at the understated importance of one little word: lament. We'll be right back. A lot of the conversation I hear around the Doctrine of Discovery is specifically about dismantling it. And dismantle seems like a more purposefully chosen word than just something like stop or remove or reverse. And I was wondering, why is dismantle the word used when talking about the Doctrine of Discovery?
Sarah Augustine, who helped to initiate and kind of energize and mobilize our coalition and still continues in leadership as an Indigenous woman, always says that the Doctrine of Discovery came out of the Christian church. And so it's the Christian church's responsibility to undo it or dismantle it. I think she has also said that it took 500 years for it to emerge, and it's going to take 500 years for this to be undone. And so this is a long haul process that our lives are only one small part of. The Doctrine of Discovery is very broad. It has spiritual dimensions, political dimensions, social dimensions. So there's a number of different layers to that, dismantling work that are interconnected. The first way or step, I think, of this journey of dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery is telling the truth. I don't think we've gotten there yet as a nation, in any way, or as churches. We've barely scratched the surface one of the first steps of doing that I think our coalition is really promoting is just starting with a land acknowledgement. Whose land are you on? Who is there before? Who's there now? What treaties was the land lost under or taken under? Doing some of that work requires us to uncenter white settler colonialism and to recenter indigenous long history of a place for thousands and thousands of years before us. So that's really, I think, spiritual work as well as just that truth-telling work. Learning the stories of the places where we live, the work of memorializing the histories that happen there, as well as lifting up the stories of indigenous resilience and resistance. I think reconciliation is sometimes thrown out there maybe as our goal. And I agree, I think it's a goal, but maybe it's the ultimate goal. Mark Charles, who's from Dene descent and from Dutch Reformed tradition, says we can't have reconciliation when we've never been conciled. So indigenous peoples and settler peoples, I think we haven't reached that step, at least in a national way, here in the US context or on Turtle Island, maybe more generally. We haven't been conciled yet. So what does conciliation mean? And lament and repentance are part of that, I think, process towards conciliation first, and comes from that, heart change that results in tangible actions of repair and reparation. Another one earlier this year, last year, a lot of Mennonites came together through some organizing led by Sarah Augustine with our coalition to uphold the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I know Mennonite Mission Network sent us a photo of folks coming together around that, which I think was really important because in the past, as I understand it, at least at Tucson Mennonite Church, was sharing that there were some Mennonite Mission Network volunteers placed with organizations that were not upholding the Indian Child Welfare Act back in the 70s and were actually these organizations were supporting adoptions. They were like indigenous children's homes that were supporting adoptions out of the tribe. So I think that's part of our repair work, is that we've been part of colonialism. Mennonite missionaries were part of Mennonite-run boarding schools that were part of this sort of civilization as mission approach of turning indigenous children into what they wanted to be, like white children or European children, where Christianity and European civilization were so enmeshed together. And so part of our repair work in mission, I think, is to really follow some of the leadership of indigenous peoples, such as that example with upholding the Indian Child Welfare Act, so that culture and language and traditions, as much as possible, can be continued. So those are just a couple of ways and examples that I think Doctrine of Discovery could be addressed.
I really appreciated what you said, kind of about the first step being that recognition and that lament. And I wondered if you might speak a little bit about that, because I think sometimes it's easy to feel that lament and grieving and recognition isn't a step, especially to people who are already in a position of power.
Yeah, I believe that lament is so crucial to the process of healing, because it marks a departure from the dominant ways of being that say it's all okay, just keep on going. If you're not being threatened, just keep yourself safe. And I think there are so many voices whispering to us all the time, and I'm saying us as a people of privilege or relative privilege, that are just saying, like, keep your head down, keep working, don't feel too much. It can be overwhelming if you feel too much. That say, like, it's not worth challenging these things. Wasn't that all in the past? Those are some of the voices that come up. My ancestors didn't do that, or we take it very personally. I think lament breaks us open to see the suffering, to feel the suffering into a place of empathy where it gets integrated into our own bodies, what maybe we suspected was happening or had like kind of a weird feeling about. Talking about from a white perspective, growing up on lands, and in my family's backyard there were these Indian pounding stones where past generations of indigenous peoples had ground their acorns. And I hear of people finding arrowheads on their land or seeing these little signs that disturb them or maybe call up questions and disrupt kind of our idea of history started with us or that our histories generally start with our settlement, with white settlement. And so it brings up a new narrative. And learning some of the stories, when you start digging deeper, those are just little starting points of recognition. Learning some of those stories and realizing the crimes against humanity that have happened under the Doctrine of Discovery. Indigenous death has just been so normalized. Black death. I think we're at a moment in time in the US history where these wounds keep coming up unless they're healed. We're dealing with the wounds of generations later after slavery, not that long ago. People were owned by other humans. People were forced from their lands or killed if they didn't cede them. We have been often raised as white settlers with this like amnesia, and Lament asks us to remember something that maybe we fear will disrupt everything. And so we're fearful of feeling lament or because it threatens our existence, our way of being. And maybe that's okay. I think that's what's needed, not just maybe. I believe like that's when healing is possible, because God is in the place God is in the place of lament and beyond lament. If we really believe in the resurrection story of Jesus, the people who wept at his tomb, the women who went, who tended his body, that I think we've been afraid to actually go and touch and see the real bodies and the wounds there. And if I'm framing this as Jesus or Christ's body as the crucified ones, if we see Jesus in the crucified, then we have to be willing to go and to see and touch the wounds ourselves and to feel those in our own bodies and allow that to shape us and change us. I don't think it's just head work, and that's where I think my work is, because I like to keep it all up here. But, I think part of that for me is like, bringing it in here. And even just touching my heart right now, you can't see on the podcast, but it brings up tears at me just to talk about this. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you, Katerina. That was really helpful. So, for people listening to this episode and wondering what the next step is, how to further the journey of lament, of recognition, and conciliation, what resources would you recommend to them? Where do you start?
Oh, there are so many resources out there. Well, I will just plug our coalition's resources.
Please do.
You launched me that softball. I feel like, I think one great way is to, go to our website, www.dfdmenno.org. And it's not the flashiest website, but you'll find what you need. There's a film there, is a great starting place for just learning about what is the Doctrine of Discovery. It's called Doctrine of Discovery, the Name of Christ. And I helped create a study guide and a series of Bible reflections that really lifted up a number of different voices from indigenous peoples and settlers, scholars, practitioners, activists, who are seeking the responses to some of those questions of what does it mean to undo the Doctrine of Discovery? How do we dig deeper into our Anabaptist tradition, into our scriptures, to both challenge the ways that the Bible has been used to justify colonialism and the Doctrine of Discovery through scripture, as well as lifting up scriptures that are more liberating to help us move forward in this restorative, reparative work. Another way I think in is, like I shared earlier, starting with a land acknowledgement in your church. in your organization or community, and not doing that as just something to check off the box or routine thing, but something that allows you to really dig deeper into research around the land where you live and to honor that, to honor the presence there, to consult and reach out to Indigenous peoples in that process in a respectful way. There's a great resource from Canada, out of Mennonite Church Canada, called Paths for Peacemaking with Host Peoples that I found really helpful, especially in the beginning stages of starting to educate ourselves as white settlers, learn appropriate ways for reaching out to or developing relationships with Indigenous peoples. But I think the first starting point is to do our own work. And I recognize that this isn't just for white people, but other people are settlers as well who come from other immigrant traditions and backgrounds. People who are coming from a background of enslavement or forced migration to the US as well can settle unknowingly on Indigenous lands. And so how can we all practice respectful ways of honoring those lands, of recognizing them, I think, as that first starting point. And just to know that, we might trip up over this. And ideally, we do as much, work as we can in communities together and churches together to kind of identify some blind spots before going into relationship building. But I think part of the process is being humble. And I just hope, maybe as a caveat with that, it's so many of these things are such a dance of freedom to make mistakes, but also I so honor and feel sensitive around our failures of respect, my failures of respect for Indigenous peoples. So I guess just an encouragement along with, yes, we make mistakes and there's grace and, keep moving forward. Also, as much as we can, ask and learn the protocols of respect. And, Indigenous nations are also diverse culturally. Within each region, there are going to be different ways of how do you honor people? How do you do gift giving or recognize the land? And so keep being in that dance of the back and forth of, yes, making mistakes and yes, following protocol and respect.
And the idea of using those mistakes to learn, not just as something you did wrong and you continue on, but using that to influence then how you approach things.
So doing that work in deep listening and humility and learning from Indigenous peoples, of course, who are not univocal. There's lots of different ways and calls that sometimes differ, but I think, heeding that call to allow our actions to be in line with our true spirit of lament, and that lament is not the opposite of healing, that it's part of the process.
Katerina, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Absolutely. Well, blessings to you both.
So, that's our second episode. Thanks for joining us. For more information about what Mennonite Mission Network is doing through partnerships across the U.S. and around the world, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or go to our website, MennoniteMission.net. If you'd like to learn more about the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition, go to dofdmenno.org. We've also got links to the resources that Katerina mentioned in this episode's description. Next time on MissionWary, we'll talk about how this complex, nuanced history of mission influences how Mennonite Mission Network does mission today. And for that, we're going to go straight to the executive director source. See you then.